To start. Good morning. It is great to see people this morning right here at Clark County Council. We are in kind of an interesting juxtaposition of topics this morning in that we have both work sessions that are of very great importance, the VBLM that we'll be talking about, and a council time agenda. And then we go into some other work sessions and all of that before we come back and say farewell until the next time. So we begin with the work session at 9 o'clock, and it is not actually 9:02 on 8/30/2023. And we begin with the very complex and interesting subject matter of vacant buildable lands model. So if we may begin with that, unless there are any changes or amendments that staff needs to discuss first.
Not for the work session, thank you.
Okay, in that event, off we go. Staff, do you wish to begin, please?
Good morning, Madam Chair and Councillors. For the record, Oliver Ojaka, Community Planning Director. And with me this morning is the GIS Manager, Jesse Manley, and Garrett, and also Jose. I believe there are other staff online who will be here to help answer questions that councillors may have. Before I start, let me just briefly say that the vacant buildable lands model is a tool that the council, or not the council, but the county has been using for over 30 years now to really assess or look at particularly our urban areas in terms of what land is vacant, underutilized, both in residential, commercial, and industrial. So we use this tool, like I said, for planning purposes, and there have been studies, there have been committees that have reviewed the model and have made recommendations to staff and to council. The last one was done, I believe, in 2021 or 2022, when we submitted, the county submitted a buildable lands report to the state under the statute that we have to submit that report to the state prior to the commencement of the periodic review. What I can say is that we do from time to time send the output of the report to our local jurisdiction, in this case, all the cities in Clark County, for them to review the report and provide us any check and balance where we can make any adjustment based on local knowledge. We do also send this out to the Building Industry Association for them also to review and provide us any comment or input. In the past, there have been what I may call studies that they have done themselves, or looking at some sample of subdivisions and or hypothetical or future project, and submit that to us, which we staff have taken a look at. The last time we did a similar thing was with our consultant, Eco Northwest, and we came to a different conclusion or different facts. So that is not in dispute, but this is a tool that, like I said, the county have been using for a very long time. And is it perfect? I wouldn't say that it is, but I would say that for the most part, I would take the model over any other jurisdiction's model, and I can stand on that. It has been challenged in the past, and we came out very successful. So I don't have to go in depth if you have questions, I'm here to answer them. I have confidence in the work that our GIS staff are doing. I, as the planning director, I am a customer to GIS. This model doesn't reside in community planning. They maintain it, they run it, and they oversee that. So with that, let me turn it over to Jesse, who will be giving the presentation this morning.
Jesse, before you begin, I've got a question, if I may.
Yes.
I'm wondering, you mentioned the difference in the models when you send them out to our many partners in the community, and some of the input that they have, which you are seeking, is different. And they then have their different approach. We have a different approach yet. And then you talked about how you reconcile some of that. I just want to be sure that we point out very clearly that this is not about a competition. It is not about a competition between staff and between our business friends out there in the community who are working with the same goals in mind that we have. And we've got to keep that in mind, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we act like we're in a competitive mode and one of us is going to win. And that is just not the case. We are seeking whatever is the truth. And that is a difficult and challenging thing when one is dealing with so much data. And I just have to make that point because it is an attitude with which we go forward. We can go forward with the attitude of, we want to be sure that you are shown to be wrong, or we want to figure out together what's right. And it's the latter approach that we must take. And so as we go forward, please, as a team, let us seek that. And just a comment to set a tone from my perspective as we begin. Staff,
Chair?
go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I just have a couple of quick questions related to the process. So in submitting this, I assume to the Commerce Department and sharing it with all the cities, were there any red flags or points of disagreement? And I think probably at that point it could have been challenged if there was a serious disagreement with the results.
Councillor Marshall, I think you're referring to the last process where we had a project advisory group that looked at this model plus the consultant that the county hired, Eco Northwest. Yeah, there were some differences of opinion. Our council, based on the work and the input, primarily based on actual development, what had occurred on the ground and so forth, using that and showing our work, if you will, which is one of the requirements. The report was submitted to the state as we are obligated to do. Yes, any group that felt the need, including cities, to appeal that had the opportunity to do so, but none did occur. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, Oliver. And Chair Bowerman. So yes, as Oliver mentioned, community planning has asked me to talk about the vacant buildable lands model, or VBLM as I'm going to refer to it from now on. And
Is there audio playing now? Because I hear none.
Chair Bowerman, I just want to confirm you can hear us again.
I can hear you now.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Jesse, if you want to continue.
Sure. I'll start with this slide again since no one could
Need
hear
to
it.
start again. I will not repeat my intro. Let's not have the staff intro repeated, but let's just begin with the report per se. Going to, what slide number would that be? 2, I think.
Yeah. All right. So what is the VBLM and what does it do? Well, the VBLM is a GIS-based tool that the Community Planning Department and the municipalities use to, 1, determine the amount of vacant and buildable lands that are available within the urban growth areas, or UGAs. 2, estimate the amount of vacant and buildable lands that are expected to convert into housing units and jobs. 3, evaluate urban area alternatives throughout the comprehensive planning process. 4, analyze land consumption rates on an annual basis to help monitor the 20-year comprehensive plan. And 5, provide an annual record of growth and land use, land use patterns that go back to the inception of the VBLM in 1994. As Oliver mentioned, the VBLM has been run on an annual basis for over 30 years, clear back to 1994. For 1994 and 1995, this was done primarily through spreadsheet-based land capacity analysis and calculations. But starting in 1996, all this was migrated to GIS-based tools to automate the analysis, ensure better consistency with the data sources and capacity calculations, and to provide a map-based view of the analysis results. This has helped us to have better understanding of the trends related to growth in Clark County, as it helped to identify land use related issues that need to be addressed. There have been several changes made to the VBLM since 1994. These changes were applied per instruction from the County Council and Community Planning. Decisions that led to these changes were a product of input that was received from the municipalities and the community. Most of the changes centered around updating the planning assumptions involved in the VBLM analysis, the analysis methodology, and the improvements to key data involved in the analysis. Really, the primary purpose of the VBLM is to ensure that Clark County follows the land use planning guidelines that are outlined in the Washington State Growth Management Act. Next slide. So how does the VBLM work? Well, the analysis criteria and planning assumptions that are used by the VBLM are determined by the municipalities, the county, and the community during the comprehensive planning process. The Clark County GIS Department implements, maintains, and runs the VBLM per instruction from the Community Planning Department and the County Council. GIS software is used to build and run the VBLM. This is primarily handled through a combination of GIS map layers, database logic, and GIS data processing tasks that execute VBLM-specific analysis processes. VBLM analysis uses the best available data that Clark County has at our disposal, which includes authoritative GIS map layers that are maintained by Clark County, the state of Washington, and various federal agencies, and the Clark County Property Assessment and Taxation Database. Additionally, we have a feedback loop in place for both the GIS map layers and the property assessment data. This feedback loop helps to improve the data that is involved in the VBLM analysis, which in turn improves the overall accuracy of the VBLM over time.
Chair, I just have a question
Yes.
on that. Could you explain a little bit more about what that feedback loop is?
We get information from planning, which in turn comes from meetings the council has, feedback we get from the community, municipalities about where they see issues with the VBLM results, and we try to focus in on what's causing those issues. We dive into the property assessment data, figure out if there's some flag that's happened on a property that's in turn converted that to a VBLM classification that may not be accurate. And then we work with the assessor to understand if that truly is the correct way to flag that property with the characteristics they've set there, because it's very opinion-based data, but it's also considered authoritative. With the GIS map layers, there's a varying degree of accuracy with those layers because of the different data sources they come from. So there's a lot of, I'll get into some of what we do with that data, but there are some things we do to try to improve the accuracy of that or to modify our planning assumptions to accommodate for the inaccuracies of those layers.
Thank you.
You bet. So GIS is great because it lets us overlay and combine relevant map layers. When these map layers are combined, their associated database tables are also joined together. This helps us identify and understand both spatial or geographic data relationships and non-spatial or tabular data relationships between the map layers. For the VBLM analysis, GIS allows us to combine authoritative map layers like parcels and environmentally constrained areas, incorporate relevant property assessment and tax exemption data, and categorize the results into VBLM-specific land classifications that can be further analyzed on tables, graphs, and maps. The VBLM is pretty straightforward in terms of GIS and data analysis, but it does involve a large amount of data. Additionally, Clark County's produced multiple years' worth of VBLM analysis results, so it becomes a lot of information to digest very quickly. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm sorry, one more. So the VBLM analysis begins at the end of every year when the municipalities submit updates to their comprehensive and zoning plans to the county. Community planning then collaborates with the municipalities to translate their comprehensive plan designations into land use categories that the VBLM understands. These VBLM-specific land use categories will determine which VBLM model type that the land use categories are analyzed within. There are three VBLM model types: residential, commercial, and industrial. Each model type has different criteria for determining what's considered vacant, underutilized, or built. These model types also determine how the VBLM analysis results will convert from gross acres to net acres of vacant and buildable land. For example, if we have a gross 1 acre vacant property, the planning assumptions for the VBLM model that property exists within will determine how much of that 1 acre is expected to be available to develop and the potential number of housing units and jobs that it is expected to yield. Those planning assumptions will differ depending on what VBLM model type that the vacant property exists within. More information about the planning assumptions, how gross acres are converted to net acres, and how yield is calculated are provided later in this presentation. So once the comprehensive plan designations have been translated into the VBLM-specific land use categories, the VBLM analysis can run. Next slide, please. So here we're showing the City of Ridgefield's 2023 comprehensive plan. And take note of the color scheme used on this map. The yellow and orange areas are residential comprehensive plan designations. The brown area is the mixed-use comprehensive plan designation. Pink and red are commercial areas. The light and dark blue are industrial areas. The greens are parks, open space, public facility, and the dark gray is large surface water bodies like rivers and lakes. Next slide. Could you possibly zoom out on the slides a little? A little more? You sure we see this. So this table we're showing here is a visual representation of how the comprehensive plan designations are translated to both the VBLM land use categories and the VBLM model types. This is a foundational component of the VBLM analysis. Most of the comprehensive plan designations translate directly to equivalent VBLM land use categories and model types. Residential to residential, commercial to commercial, pretty straightforward. However, there are comprehensive plan designations that don't always translate in a straightforward manner. In this example, you can see that the urban medium density residential comprehensive plan designation gets translated to the urban high density VBLM land use category. This is because the VBLM does not have an urban medium density land use category associated with it. Mixed use is another comprehensive plan designation that doesn't directly translate to a VBLM land use category or model type. This is because mixed use designations are used by the municipalities for different purposes, mostly for residential and commercial. Community planning deals with these translation issues by working with the municipalities to define how their comprehensive plan designation should be translated to the VBLM specific land use categories. Some comprehensive plan designations are not translated from a VBLM land use category to a model type at all. This is because there's no housing units or jobs associated with those, with certain comprehensive plan designations, so they're simply excluded from the VBLM analysis. In this example, you can see that the parks and open space, public facility, and water comprehensive plan designations are not translated to a VBLM model type. Again, there's no housing units or jobs associated with those designations, so they are simply excluded from the VBLM analysis. Next slide, please. So this slide shows how the City of Ridgefield's comprehensive plan was translated to the VBLM land use categories. I used a similar color scheme on this to highlight how it's very similar. So again, red and orange residential, brown mixed use, commercials red, industrials blue, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. And this slide shows how those land use categories were now translated to the VBLM model types. Again, similar color scheme, a little more simplified. Residential, commercial, industrial, or none. Those are the areas that are excluded. The model type that each VBLM category land use translates to will determine the number of housing units and jobs that the vacant, underutilized lands within those land use categories are expected to produce. The VBLM model types that you see on this slide are how we represent the gross acres of land that are estimated to be available for housing units and jobs. Once all the areas within the UGAs have been assigned to a model type, the VBLM will calculate the net acres of available land by factoring in the analysis criteria that the municipalities, county, and community have agreed on, and by deducting the planning assumptions that are associated with each model type. Next slide. So what does the VBLM classify as vacant? For the 2023 VBLM analysis, the maximum building value amounts, or thresholds as we call them, that the VBLM used to classify properties as vacant were $34,273 for residential properties, $150,838 or less for commercial properties, $146,195 or less for industrial properties. These building value thresholds are updated every year using the same rate of change that was observed for all the building values within the UGAs over the course of the previous year. This helps the VBLM account for changing home values and inflation. Next slide, please. This slide shows what the vacant classifications look like for the city of Ridgefield. They're pretty evenly distributed, and again, the color scheme and categories are similar to the original comprehensive plan map. Next slide, please. So what does the VBLM classify as underutilized? Underutilized is a bit more complex. We need to define it first. What we consider underutilized is areas that we consider that have enough capacity for a better and higher use. That means it could be housing, employment, or both. Underutilized is mostly geared towards catching farms with outbuildings in the urban growth areas that are ripe for redevelopment. An underutilized property will have improvements in structures, but the highest and best use of the property would be to provide more housing units and/or jobs than what are currently present. Underutilized is based on building value per acre, which is calculated by dividing a property's building value by its assessed acreage. To be classified by the VBLM as underutilized, residential properties must meet two criteria. One, be a minimum of 1 acre in size. Two, have a building value per acre in the bottom 10th percentile of all observed building value per acre values within the urban growth areas. The percentile approach for building value per acre is nice because it changes every year in relationship to how all building value per acre values within the UGAs as a whole change. This means that it automatically adjusts for changes to home values in inflation. For the 2023 VBLM analysis, the building value per acre threshold that it used to classify residential properties as underutilized was $748,000 or less. The building value per acre thresholds for commercial and industrial properties are handled differently, as they are adjusted every year by the observed overall rate of change in property values within the UGAs. For the 2023 VBLM analysis, the building value per acre threshold that the VBLM used to classify commercial properties as underutilized was $108,292 and $111,732 for industrial properties. It's important to note that if building value per acre thresholds are set too low, the only properties that will be classified as underutilized will be farms with barns that have low building values. This will not provide an accurate measurement of the underutilized areas. It should also be noted that even though the VBLM classifies properties as underutilized, that doesn't mean that they will always develop into denser housing. Some property owners will never sell their properties. Some will only sell a portion of their property's vacant and buildable area. These are all things that are considered by the municipalities, counties, and community when determining the planning assumptions that are associated with each VBLM model type and the overall VBLM analysis. Next slide, please. Here's another view of how the building value per acre threshold is determined for underutilized residential properties. The threshold is the 10th percentile of building value per acre for residential properties from the previous assessment year, which in this example is 2022. As the graph shows, the 10th percentile for the 2022 residential building value per acre values was $748,000. So that number became the building value per acre threshold that the 2023 VBLM analysis used to classify 1 acre or larger residential properties as underutilized. For example, say we have a house that sits on a 2-acre property. Since the property is zoned for residential use and has a building value per acre of $300,000, the property is zoned for residential use and has a building value per acre of $300,000. Since that building value per acre is below the $748,000 threshold and the property is larger than 1 acre, the property will be classified by the VBLM as residential underutilized, and as it will be considered to have a higher and best use with medium or high density housing. Again, the percentile approach for determining building value per acre for residential underutilized works well because it automatically adjusts every year in relationship to how all the building value per acre values within the UGAs have changed over the previous year. Next slide, please. For commercial and industrial properties, the building value per acre threshold is handled in more of a relative fashion. The building value per acre threshold from the previous year is carried through and adjusted by the rate of change that was observed in the overall building value per acre values within the UGAs since the previous year. This is different from the percentile approach in that the rate of change for the building value per acre threshold for commercial and industrial properties must be calculated and is not automatically adjusted. The starting point for these annual relative increases for commercial and industrial properties was $50,000 back in 2006. The building value per acre thresholds for commercial and industrial properties are recalculated on an annual basis. As the graph shows, the 2023 building value per acre thresholds that the VBLM used to classify commercial properties underutilized was $108,292 and $111,732 for industrial properties. Next slide, please. So after all that's done, this is what underutilized looks like for the city of Ridgefield. As you can see, there's not much residential underutilized in the urban areas of Ridgefield because there are not many 1-acre properties in those areas. We see this trend across all the municipalities in the county. Again, underutilized is mostly geared towards catching the farms with outbuildings that are ripe for redevelopment. Next slide. And this map shows the city of Ridgefield's vacant and underutilized classifications that were identified by the 2023 VBLM analysis. Next slide. So properties that are not classified by the VBLM as vacant or underutilized are classified as built. The built classification is a catch-all for areas that are not expected to ever develop into housing and or jobs. Due to this, built properties are completely excluded from the VBLM analysis. There are many different types of areas that are classified by the VBLM as built, and the main types are shown on this slide. These areas have all been identified by the municipalities, county, and the community during the previous reviews of the VBLM. Some of these areas were identified as built from infrastructure studies that were performed in the past. Next slide. This slide shows the city of Ridgefield's built, vacant, and underutilized classifications that were identified by the 2023 VBLM analysis. Gray and dark green areas within the Ridgefield UGA indicate what VBLM classifies as built. Next slide. The next thing that's considered by the VBLM analysis is the rate at which vacant and underutilized lands are expected to develop. The rate of development is driven by two main factors, market factors and policy and regulation factors. For market factors, we understand that vacant land is more likely to develop than underutilized land as it's considered to be shovel-ready. This means that vacant land will have a higher rate of conversion to housing units and jobs than underutilized land. We also assume that some land will not develop at all during the 20-year comprehensive plan, as we know some property owners will never be willing to sell or develop their land. For policy and regulation factors, we know that environmentally constrained areas are not likely to develop due to policies and regulations that protect those lands. Due to that, we assume that constrained areas will yield a significantly lower amount of vacant and underutilized land. We also recognize that infrastructure, roads, alleys, sidewalks, utilities, etc., will be required for any new development, and it will consume a portion of the available vacant and underutilized land. Next slide.
Could we slow down for a second? Is there backup of your slides that show the factors involved? I'm having trouble at this point following from what we are seeing visually to what's on paper. I'm sorry.
We're asking what the factors are?
No. Can we see them in writing somewhere? In other words, you've got a great set of slides here, and I'm having trouble finding the interpretation or definitions or meanings or wherever you got the what the information is. I know you've got great backup for every sentence you have here. I just can't find it.
We're going to get into the planning assumptions. We're going to give an overview of what drives the planning assumptions with this slide. But the planning assumptions really get down to three main categories, which I'll discuss here in a bit. They're basically reductions we apply to these vacant, underutilized lands, and they're based on these factors that we're describing here. There's three main reductions. There's constrained lands, the environmental constraints, what we consider never to develop land, and infrastructure. Three main pieces.
Well, for example, right now, what slide are you on?
We're on slide 20, the rates of development.
I'll just need to have a little slower take of it when I go through it, which I thought I'd already done, but I'm not separating out the points that you're making yet. So clearly, I'm not segregating the information from the slide as I should. So bear with me and just please take it easy on the interpretation using the verbiage that you are. I'm
Definitely.
sorry. It's just not second nature, and I'm not seeing it on paper. So
No problem, and feel free to interrupt. A lot of this we'll get to in some slides down the line where it gets to more of the detail of what these factors are.
okay, great.
All right, next slide. So the environmental constraints. Once the market policy and regulation factors have been applied, the VBLM analysis will further reduce the amount of vacant and underutilized land to account for the environmentally constrained areas. Constrained areas are described in County and Municipal Development Code and mapped in GIS. Clark County GIS obtains the map layers that represent constrained areas from authoritative data sources like the state of Washington and various federal agencies. These are the same GIS map layers that are reviewed by county permitting staff when someone applies for a development-related permit. It's important to note that the GIS map layers that represent constrained areas are only used as indicators of potential. It does not always mean that the constrained areas actually exist where they are mapped. And this is inherent. This is due to the data sources and how these layers are mapped by those data sources. There's scale issues. There's a variety of factors that go into play here. The GIS map layers that we use for constrained areas are fed into the county's permitting system and used to flag properties as having potential environmental constraints. This means that if someone applies for a development-related permit and there's a flag on their property for the potential presence of wetlands, the county will require them to get a site-specific survey done to verify that the wetlands actually exist and how they would impact the property for development. It's also important to note that some of the constrained areas are slightly overstated in GIS. For example, if there's a stream present, it only appears in GIS as a line with no width. A buffer area is applied to these stream features to ensure that areas of ecological importance are accounted for in ways that ensure they're identified, reviewed, and protected if needed during the permit review process. All of these GIS map layers for environmental constraints carry through to the VBLM analysis. Typically, the constrained areas will be protected from development and will not be considered as vacant or buildable lands. However, the previous years of VBLM analysis and feedback from the community have shown that in some cases, the constrained areas will get developed. The planning assumptions that the municipalities, county, and community determine try to account for this, and they are adjusted periodically to ensure that when applied, the VBLM analysis will reflect the development activities that can actually happen on these environmentally constrained areas. Next slide, please.
Chair, I have a question on that.
Go ahead.
Do we have, is there any way to track how well our assumptions have been as far as wetlands, we don't know for sure, but good to be safe and say there's a potential? Do we know over time how accurate that may have been? Is there a way to tell?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Jose and Oliver, but I believe we rely on feedback from the community and the municipalities on these layers and what we're considering vacant, constrained, and so on and so forth. We adjust those planning assumptions that we apply. It would say that if there is constraints present, X amount will be excluded from what we would consider vacant and buildable, and that is adjusted based on some of the input we get over time. Is that correct?
I'm just wondering how accurate that has been, if the assumptions have held up most of the time or 50% of the time.
So historically, what we've had is a review of the subdivisions that have been platted over time. In the buildable lands report, we hired Eco Northwest, and they also had a sub AHBL who was specializing in stormwater and some of those environmental issues. So they did an analysis of all of the development historically and within the last 6-year period to see how we were doing relative to our assumptions, and we can provide that information. We have gone from when we first started, there was 100% deduction for critical lands. Over time, we observed that because of some of the features Jesse mentioned, that we were seeing development happening on those critical lands. And so we've adjusted that over time, and now we're at 50%. And so I think in the last 6 years, there were some changes. I think there was development of, I think it was 40%, and I can share that analysis with the council. And just one of the other things that came out of that analysis with our consultants was to take into account some of the changes that were forthcoming with what we were going to update our environmental policies. And so we expanded the amount of land that was used for infrastructure deduction. A lot of times, development had used the buffers to locate stormwater facilities, and that was going to change in the updated regulations. So we accounted for that by expanding the infrastructure deduction.
Thank you.
Next slide. So this slide is a view of the environmentally constrained areas. We have a master layer for the entire county that we use and keep updated on, and whenever we get updated information from the various agencies we collect the data from and feedback from the Clark County staff on changes we're making based on code. So here the dark gray areas that are shown on this slide represent the environmental constrained areas. There's not much land within the Ridgefield UGA that isn't impacted by these environmental constraints. However, we have to remember that some development can occur on these constrained lands. And on this example, you can visualize this by seeing how much of the built land, the gray and green areas, the light gray and green areas that exist within the city of Ridgefield UGA. You can see that the dark gray areas overlap them, but they're still considered built. So there is some development occurring. Next slide, please. This slide shows what the City of Ridgefield's final VBLM classifications are for 2023. The lighter shades of each color are areas that are likely to develop at a faster rate. Darker shades of each color are areas that have environmental constraints that will impede their development. The light gray, dark gray, and green areas within the City of Ridgefield's UGA represent what the VBLM classifies as built. This is the final map layer that is produced from the VBLM analysis. It's a combination of the vacant, underutilized, and built classifications and the environmental constraints. Once this map layer is produced, the VBLM applies the planning assumptions in order to calculate the amount of vacant and underutilized land that the residential, commercial, and industrial areas are expected to produce. When we look at vacant and underutilized and constrained versus not constrained, we start to understand how much land may be available to develop. At this point, the VBLM has translated the VBLM specific land use categories into the final VBLM classifications and has calculated the gross acres of vacant and buildable land for each classification. The next step is to apply the reductions from the planning assumptions to determine the net acres of vacant and buildable land. The table on this slide provides an overview of the reductions that are applied. The reductions are applied in a stepwise fashion, meaning the first reduction is applied for the constrained areas. After that, the remaining area is reduced even further by the never to develop reduction. And finally, the remaining area from that reduction is reduced even further by the reduction amount for infrastructure. Gross to net acre conversions for other I jumped ahead. So to give you an example of how this works.
Quick question. How is the infrastructure accounted for in the never to develop? Is it included?
No, it's not.
So it's like its own separate category. So we're looking at 50%, 30%, plus 31.5. Looking across. I see.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And to give you an example of how this reduction works, say we have 1 gross acre of vacant constrained land, so the third item down on the table. So initially we would reduce that 1 acre by 50% to get a half acre. That 50% would come out being considered constrained areas, reduce it by 50%. The remaining half acre is further reduced by 10% for what we consider never to develop land. That leaves us with 0.45 acres. That is reduced even more by the infrastructure reduction for 31.5%. Altogether, this leaves us with 0.31 net acres of residential vacant constrained land of the original 1 acre, and that's what the VBLM expects to be available for development. These gross to net acre conversions for the other residential, commercial, and industrial VBLM classifications will vary and are outlined in the planning assumptions that are determined by the municipalities, county, and the community. Yield is the term that we use to represent the expected capacity for housing units and jobs for the final VBLM classifications. Yield is calculated by multiplying the net acres of developable land by the planning assumptions for the expected number of housing units or jobs per net acre. Next slide. Here's another example of how gross acres are converted to net acres for a residential property with 100 gross acres. If the property is classified by the VBLM as vacant, after all the planning assumptions are applied, we would expect 61.65 net acres to be available to develop over the 20-year time frame of the comprehensive plan. If the property is classified as underutilized constraint, we would expect 25.3 net acres to be available to develop. As you can see, if the 100-acre property is classified by the VBLM as underutilized, it will yield much less in terms of housing units and jobs than a 100-acre vacant property. Next slide. What's new with the VBLM? Well, last year, the Buildable Lands Report was released, and we adjusted the VBLM analysis criteria and planning assumptions based on the information in that report. This was adopted by the County Council, and the full list of the updates are available to review in County Resolution 2022-0601. Late 2023, we're going to release a new and rebuilt version of the VBLM. My staff has been working on this over the past year. We had little experience with this. Our predecessor, the position I got, he handled most of the VBLM work and left us with a workable tool, but we didn't really know anything about it and we're having trouble running it. So we decided to refactor it, rebuild it, to increase the performance and to have a little more insight into what's going on in the background. And with that, we are adjusting it to be based on zoning designations rather than comprehensive plan designations. This change is expected to provide more accurate results from the VBLM, and it's going to ensure that we're compliant with the requirements outlined in the recently adopted Washington State House Bill 1220. The rebuilt VBLM tool will also have a better ability to incorporate direction from council and community planning. The previous version was difficult and time-consuming to modify when analysis methodology, data sources, and planning assumptions were updated. The previous version was also unable to capture special land uses that were not directly captured in the municipality's comprehensive plans. Classic example, there's a lot of things happening in Vancouver and downtown and the waterfront that weren't directly captured in their comprehensive plan, and it made it very difficult to adjust the back end of the VBLM to accommodate for those things. So what we've done in this refactored tool is we're setting things up to be able to accommodate these types of changes and flag them and note them in the report that specific changes were made. So that's the presentation. It's open for comments and questions now.
Chair, I have a couple. Thanks so much for this technical report. Just in thinking about the refactoring things, is it will, I'm just wondering how, if assumptions will be adjusted, I guess they will, from what was the resolution that was adopted, and if, how the public has an opportunity to participate in that.
Yes, I believe that the process is we release the results, the municipalities have time to consume it, provide feedback, and then that at some point there can be a work session with council, with the community involved, to receive comment and to take recommendations for adjusting planning assumptions in various parts of the VBLM. The council then would decide what they'd like to move forward with and adopt a resolution that we would then implement into the model.
Great. And then, you know, just mentioning City of Vancouver and changes that have happened there, I'm wondering what impact the housing options and some of the code changes, which will foster more dense development in the urban, unincorporated area of Clark County. I would just flag that as something to consider.
Definitely. Yeah, we expect just the change to be zoning based instead of comprehensive plan based is going to get a lot more accurate and granular results from the VBLM. But with those zoning, that change to zoning, it will, the planning assumptions, the expected capacity, things like that that the VBLM considers, the cities provide that information to us per zoning designation.
Right. I'm not sure I understand the difference between based on zoning versus the comprehensive plan, because the comprehensive plan is zoning, so I'm not quite sure the distinction.
Councillors, this is Oliver again. The comprehensive plan, and I think Jose may jump in here, the comprehensive plan looks at a very high-level area. For example, you have urban law. Within that urban law, you have single-family R15, R110, R120, and make an assumption of what the various densities will be, and then we base that on potential density that will occur. When you go to zoning, we operate with two maps. One is the comp plan and the zoning. When you go to the zoning, the properties are zoned very similar to R16, R175, R110, and R120. You look at what is actually occurring on the ground or what is planned to happen there. So you use that as the basis when you run it on zoning. And I know I see my staff here, Jose, who may further jump in on that, but that's part of the significant changes that will occur. Plus, as Jesse mentioned, we have the new House Bill 1220 that is asking us now to plan for a variety of housing type, fourplex, duplex, townhouses, cottage housing, you name it. And another bill, 1110, which is particular to the cities, but in here in Clark County will be particular to the cities of Vancouver and Commerce, that is allowing them to plan for sixplex. That is going to be based on zoning. So the information that we are going to be receiving from the cities is going to be on planned densities that they expected to comply with those two, to comply particularly with the 1110, and for the county to comply with that 1220. The council haven't made a decision on the proposed code changes that we came to you, so we are working on that. Finally, when you adopt that, we will reassess to see what that means in terms of plan densities going forward. That is some of the things that Jesse is referring to in terms of improvement that will be made to the model. Jose, I don't know if you have anything else to add. Go ahead.
The only thing I was going to add was the difference between comp plan and zoning. We have had an aggregate number. So for the Vancouver, the entirety of the Vancouver UGA, the assumption has been we will see 8 dwelling units per acre overall.
Would you repeat that, please?
And the previous assumption had been 8 dwelling units per acre was what we were going to see. So that's all of the vacant land, regardless of what zoning it was. We just applied a density number of 8. with the zoning, we're going to be able to more accurately represent the range from 2 dwelling units to 43 is what our current range is in the unincorporated county, sort of based on what we've achieved, what we see, what's happening on the ground. And so, like Jesse mentioned, that'll give us more granular detail and will allow us to comply with some of the changes that are being proposed in HB 1220, where you're required to allow for greater density on single-family lots. And so we're working with the jurisdictions to provide us that information based on their zones, so we can put that into the model.
Great, thanks for that further explanation, but it sounds like it's all leading toward greater accuracy.
We hope, yes.
That's always the goal. Yep.
Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
I have quite a few questions, so please bear with me on this. I dropped my kids off at school this morning. I feel like I've dropped myself off to school as well. So I appreciate all of this. It's a lot to take in. I do have a lot of questions that really good questions that have been brought up to me by the community, and some of it involves some of the assumptions in the model and some of the practical things that come out of it. So one thing, for example, is as we as time progresses and things build out, kind of the easier places are picked. The easier to build places are picked. So as time goes on, the lots that still haven't developed are typically not being developed for a reason. And so I'm curious, how are we going? Are we going back and trying to figure out why these ones that have been sitting in the inventory for a long time are not converting, and should they be removed or, transferred to a different use that would be more appropriate and might build out? How are we working with that?
That's a difficult one because, as you know, Councillor Young, properties, as we flag, some of them will not convert during the 20-year planning horizon for a variety of reasons. One, the property owner may decide not to sell. The property may be very difficult to develop in combination with some environmental issues. Some may be access issues. Some may just be for other variety of reasons. I mentioned access, and the cost to develop that property may be the reason why someone passed that over, but it doesn't mean that the property cannot develop. So there's a variety of reasons. There are also other reasons that we have looked at in the past. I'll give an example. In the some industrial areas, for example, that are very incumbent with environmental constraints. How much of that is really available is something that we have to continue to monitor. And we also know, for example, that when it comes to commercial and industrial, that takes longer to develop or to come online. There are some examples where you can look at whether it's along 162nd, for example. I'm very familiar with that area. I'm just using it as an example. It has been there, zone industrial, for quite some time. But now it's coming online. That's what I mean by longevity before those areas come online. There are other areas just because of size that may not be what a prospective buyer or user is looking for because it doesn't meet their size requirements. So it may be like they pass over and remain so. So there's a variety of factors that one will have to consider. The other thing is that it will become a challenge when you said, okay, this property haven't developed. what should it now be, or what should we consider that to be? That is a decision that the the city will have to make, and here in the county that we have to make. We staff cannot make any changes to what should that be. We do get application from time to time to go from one zone to the other, and it goes through the legislative process where it comes before you and you make a change. So there are a variety of things that could make a property not being ready to develop, and then there are other issues that legislatively that could happen to change from one zone to the next if that is the best, highest use of the property.
Thank you for that. I think this is an incredibly important decision. One of the things that was mentioned to me and it dawned on me, I'm like, that is very true, is that, you know, housing prices, they continue to skyrocket. So cost for people to live here keeps going up and up and up, and it is critical that we make sure that we have employment growing at a rate. That's our only way to keep our housing affordability when prices are going up, is that our wages are increasing. Those jobs that are coming in are good. So I think I think this is really critical that I think this model is important to look at and give us some ideas of what's out there, but I think it's important for us to also look at what is actually out there. Is it what we want for employment in Clark County? Is it what we need? And I know, you know, some of the land develops out in critical areas, but I know that there are businesses that shop around in all environments, and they may find our county attractive to work in, but they can't wait 3 years for the process to go through to work through all of the difficulties that come with that land. And then infrastructure has a big play in it. You know, some of this land is not close enough to infrastructure to where it will ever amount to anything that we need here in Clark County. So this is I mean, this whole issue is very critical. And then the other thought that has come to me is, do we want our critical areas to convert? Do we? I mean, is that something that we really want to have happen? Do we want to have our buffered areas built in? Do we want to have our treed areas converted? You know, things like that. Do we want to have that kind of change in our county? So I think it's important that we look at not just what's happening, but what we want to happen in the county. The other question is just just to kind of place some emphasis on the importance of this is, what if we're wrong and we don't provide enough job land? What are the consequences going to be for that? So, and a lot of my questions you answered during the presentation, which I appreciate. But one of the things that I would recommend is, having spoken with CREDC, there's a grant available that would require a local match, but it would help us to kind of study some of these things and figure out, you know, what do we want to do as a county? How do we want that developed? And then look at it and say, do we have what we need here to achieve that? And if not, what can we do, if it's possible, to make adjustments to do that? And that's something that I would hope that the council would be supportive of moving forward. From my understanding, that grant, the application would be due sometime in September, so it's something that we would have to work on quickly if we were going to do that. And I think that's it, but I let Chair Bowerman go ahead with her thoughts and questions. I'll look over my notes and see if I missed anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chair Bowerman, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Are there other questions or thoughts that the council wishes to bring forward now, not as a point of minutia, but as a point of, let's make sure that we talk about this as a an area that we want to develop and see developed when this comes to us the next time, because there is a next time, a next time, a next time, and each time this can become more fleshed out and more clear, expressing more clearly what the community wants. For example, on the point that you just last stated, Councilor Young, I don't think we as a council have our individual opinions, but I don't think that we have a community realization yet. Maybe we never will, but I hope we do, of what the community does want, say in terms of density, for instance. And until we have that, much of what follows is the minutia that I'm talking about that isn't as valuable when we don't have the big picture. And the big picture is kind of slippery right now. And what the community really feels is appropriate for density, I think, is all over the map, literally. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do, I think, in developing and understanding how we will get to the important big points on which we develop. And I think that we don't have a clear sense of that yet. That, I think, will be the basis that is the most important for decision making. So those are my thoughts.
Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead.
My question is for staff. How do we know that critical areas haven't been inadvertently counted as buildable lands? This is a staff question.
Okay, how do we know that land hasn't been inadvertently identified as critical land?
How do we know that critical lands haven't been counted as part of buildable lands? Like, do you have that sorted out? Like, do you know for sure that some of the critical areas haven't been counted as buildable land?
Right, so what we do is get the critical layers that identify where potentially critical lands are, and that's part of our inventory. When development actually happens, based on that, based on those indicators, development has to either assure the county that they're not going to build on critical lands, or meet the adopted policies that allow for development and mitigate the impacts to critical lands. The assumption that's in the model is just reflecting what has been developing. So as development occurs on land throughout the county has critical lands everywhere. Urban, rural, wherever you expand to, there are critical lands. The policies that you've adopted to protect those are still in place. What the model assumptions are reflecting is what's happening. So we're seeing that the development is happening on some of those lands that have indicators of critical land. So it may be the case that there's some mitigation for development in critical lands, or we're overestimating that these lands are critical. And there's some things that we've identified that would still allow for development, even though they're under the auspices of critical land. The CARA protection allows for development. So we're just using the tool that identifies these as potential critical, and then reflecting what's actually happening on the ground.
Okay, thank you so much.
Jose, just to add to that, and this is not my area of expertise, so correct me if I'm wrong. So the vacant buildable lands report that council adopted in 2022 is it's a history. It's not the forward. It's talking about what has been developed, what has been identified historically. It's not the what do you want to do, correct?
Right, the buildable lands report is looking back 5 years to see how we've grown and have we met our assumptions and where are we relative to those assumptions, and do we have significant capacity to accommodate the 20-year projection that happened in 2016.
And both Jose and the county manager are correct, and the council knows this already, that it is the data, it is that data that informs us in terms of what is happening and what changes, if any, needs to be made. It is all driven by what have happened, what we have observed, and then what adjustment, if any, needs to be made. The idea that 50% of our constrained land will not develop, as Jose indicated, and Jesse, the critical layer is just an indicator of the feasibility of property developing, given that environmental constraint. What we are seeing is that when you go out there on the ground, do your delineation, and look at the type of wetland, what type of buffer, sometimes that shrinks. If you look at the environmental constraints, sometimes that shrinks. So we are seeing actually what is occurring, and then using that to inform us what do we do going forward and how should we look at those critical areas. Like I said, the area is not perfect. These are secondary data, and we are constantly monitoring what is happening. It's not like the question that Councillor Belcock asked. Some folks are also asking us, why are we developing on critical land? And we said, no, we are not. We have what is called reasonable use, Kera and other areas you can still develop. And you can do density transfer in some cases. So there are things that we are seeing. And then in some cases, you're seeing development occurring where environmental constraint area becomes a greenway or back to your yard, and some of your yard include some environmental constraint areas. So there's so many things that are happening, and we're observing that and reporting that back as what we are seeing, and then asking our council and the community at large on what type of changes needs to be made, if any. Some have suggested we reduce the 50%, won't convert to 40 because of what we've seen. The council made a decision to keep that 50%. So it's something that we are going to continue to monitor and see what happens.
Chair, I'd just like to make a note on the sensitive lands and conversion of those lands. In an ideal world, it would all be protected, but there's state and federal regulations that allow for the development on those lands, and the charge is to avoid wherever you can, to minimize and to mitigate. And in the mitigation, the goal is no net loss. I'm not quite sure if we're meeting that, but there's allowance for, and the reality is that those lands are being developed.
Are there further questions in preparation for the next sessions that follow that council wishes to ask today?
Councillors, this is Oliver. This is our presentation as we define this presentation. It's just an overview of the vacant buildable lands model, how it works, how we use it, and the next work session we'll have with council will be on planning assumptions. And as Jose indicated, we are meeting with our local jurisdictions. They are providing us information relative to this new bill that we talked about, 1110, for the cities impacted, and for the county, the House Bill 1220. Hopefully, we will work on that code amendment relating to the housing action plan so that the council may make a final decision. It is true that areas that we are going to focus on going forward is on the planned density because of these two new legislation. We are going to come back to you with those planning assumptions and what the cities are suggesting that we take into account so that they can comply with those statutes. It is something that whatever we come to you with, at the end of the day, we are going to be working with the cities to agree with the help of our GIS staff in running the model to come to what we can say that is the true capacity or planned capacity before we think about any other thing we're going to do as part of the 2025 planning process. So there's more to come. You haven't made some key decisions on some assumptions that we are going to be considering. So that's the next work session coming up, perhaps September 20th.
I do
Well,
have
very
just
good.
one. I
Go
do
ahead,
have just one
Councilor.
final question, and some of these are fundamental things that we're deciding that direct how we're going to grow. And I'm just wondering the status of the public engagement process and if that is going on now, or when would the public be able to really have more of a chance to weigh in?
There are steps in our public participation plan where the public will have an opportunity to weigh in. We haven't conducted any open houses, but that is on the table for us to do.
Chair, I got one more quick kind of comment question and real fast.
Sure, and then I'd
if I may.
appreciate a follow-up from staff also on this comment that you had regarding open houses. I was not aware of that.
Great. So we received a report from Northwest Partners for a Stronger Community that had a couple pages of questions in there. A lot of them are questions that really can't be answered by staff, but some of them are some kind of statistical type questions. And if those could be answered, that would be great. Not now, but offline.
And I can send also to all the councilors, I know I forwarded you the link last night, but there's a lot of great data and information on the buildable lands report and the process that they went through and the different data points and decisions. So I'll forward that to council as well if you want to learn more about the historical decision-making process in your preparation for the next step.
Thank you.
And what is it about the open houses that you had mentioned earlier?
Councillor Baumann, that is in relation to question that Councillor Marshall asked me about public participation. I said we have not, but we do schedule as part of the 2025 planning process to go out and do open houses and provide opportunity for the public to weigh in on some of the things that we are discussing and what will be coming before you. We are not even at a point yet where we have done the, for example, allocation. We haven't done that. We haven't even get to a point of coming up with alternatives which we can take out to the public. We have not come to a point where we'll have a preferred plan which will also go out to the public to provide us input. We're not there yet. This is just trying to lay the groundwork and all the information that councillors need to prepare you to give us direction to move forward. And not only the county, but also our local jurisdiction. They're paying attention, they are participating, they're going through the same process that we are, but we are not at a point. The next step will be after the planning assumption and direction from council, we will then be engaged in the cities in the allocation of the population and the job numbers that you've already made decisions on. We haven't done that. So there's nothing really for us to work on yet. And we haven't even landed on what is the current capacity within the existing UGA. We need to nail that down, and the smaller cities needs to come to the table and say, yes, here is our true capacity. And if we can agree on that, again, bear in mind that I mentioned 1220 and 1110. Those are bills we have to comply with as part of this planning process. So we are getting that information slowly from the cities. There are some other issues that are not before you here. We did mention that there are certain things that are occurring within the city of Vancouver. We need to engage them and understand that, how that will impact the true capacity. Those are some of the things that we need to meet with the city before we come to the council. I don't want us to be in disagreement or whatever. We all want to work together to make sure that everyone is on board, including the public.
Yeah, thank you. I just ask about the open house concept because that is a difficult one to apply on such an enormous and complex set of issues as are before the county with this. And so I would caution that as you think about that and think about, are you going to actually develop that and how so? Do some finger pointing, if you will, so that the issues that are to be highlighted in the open house are clearly highlighted. And the finger is pointed at them so that the conversation doesn't become one of 9,000 points that are difficult to integrate. You know what I'm saying? But instead, that represent a few that are the subject of the questions at hand. So I don't know what the questions at hand the cities and the county would want to be, but they could be simple things. And when you get simple answers to big questions, you can make progress. So are we talking, for example, density in a particular city? Take Richfield. Is that what we're talking about? And if so, that's something that we can focus on and get some understanding on, and then move from there. So that's just my comment on open houses, because that is can be, if not managed, too amorphous. And amorphous stuff doesn't help very much in decision making, as we well know. Is there any other comment from council that you wish to make before we close out for today? Well, hearing none, I think we have a lot of great closeout information at hand already if we use it. If we take what we've heard and we incorporate it and we utilize it in our thought process and decision making. Not always more here, more there, but sometimes integrating in order to come to what is our understanding of the whole. Well, since I heard no more further comments, we will call a close to the work session. And thank you greatly, staff, for your presentation. And I look forward to being able to follow through with much of this online so that it is something that is retained in our consciousness as we go forward with decision making. And with that, I believe we are ready to move into council time. So unless there is any objection to that, it is